Orcs are one of the staples of fantasy worlds, and much like any major element of fantasy, people seem to have some very crystallized ideas of what orcs are supposed to be. If you ask most people about what orcs are like, you'd probably mostly get one of two answers. First off, they're monsters, raiders, barbarians, worshippers of evil gods. But as fantasy tries to move on from one-dimensional evil races, ideas of orcs as more than brutish mooks to be slaughtered emerged. Most people would call those other ones the Blizzard Orcs, even though the idea is not uniquely or even originally Blizzard's. But these ones are honorable warriors. They still like to fight, but there's an element of respect in them. However, when you really look at orcs in fiction and things associated with orcs, you will see there are more ideas of what orcs are supposed to be. And strangely enough, they seem to be color-coded. As usual in these, I like to go over the history of the concept first. Tolkien didn't invent the word orc. It appears in Old English literature, including Beowulf, but the idea of what it's supposed to be isn't really clear. It's used almost interchangeably with words like goblins and devils for something vaguely demonic, tied to the underworld, and no doubt because of the Roman god Orcus, though Tolkien himself disagreed. Beowulf describes them as demon corpses, a corrupted creature somewhere between undead and demons, descended from Cain from the Bible. Before modern literature started really categorizing things, a general idea of something evil, corrupt. As you see, evil lies in the conceptual core of an orc, but Tolkien did much more with it. If you watched the Peter Jackson movies, you would think Tolkien orcs were created from this sludge or mud or whatever that was. However, in the books, orcs were actually a true breeding race. The first orcs were elves corrupted by the power of the rings, but then their children became more orcs. Tolkien himself would later lament this choice and regret that he made a whole race of people who were inherently evil. I don't doubt that, had he seen the movies, he would have approved of this choice. However, it's an important note to this distinction because it inspired much of the future fantasy of an orc. Another important thing to note about orcs is that Tolkien didn't make a distinction between orcs and goblins. Like in the old literature that he was inspired by, both terms described the same creatures. The goblins weren't even smaller. It was only later fantasy like D&D that really invented goblins as a separate thing. This video won't be talking about goblins, and if I ever make a video about them, I will return to this topic. Orcs are ugly, corrupt, evil. To this day you see the word used as an insult. Peter Jackson, for instance, made one of his orc models look like Harvey Weinstein, and I can kind of see why, on the inside and on the outside. Even with the Ukraine war, special military operation, Ukrainians would end up calling Russians orcs, because they were invaders and they wanted to dehumanize their enemies as something hellish, ugly, brutish. Taking a stand in modern geopolitical conflicts is not the point of this video, but I'm generally not a fan of dehumanizing people you fight, because that's how you radicalize people. And the fact that to this day the word orc is used for that says a lot about our collective imagination of what it stands for. That was ultimately the legacy of Tolkien's orcs. The first type of orcs in modern fantasy is largely derived from that original Tolkienian concept. More often than not, presented with this grey skin, these orcs are characterized by being ugly and brutish. The idea of these grey orcs was popularized in our common imagination by Dungeons & Dragons, of course. Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson and the others who started the genre were of course inspired by Tolkien's orcs, and they made them a true breeding race of always chaotic evil creatures that players could fight. They weren't the only such race at the time, but it cemented the idea of an orc for most people. From then on, for decades, orcs would continue to be these one-dimensional evil monsters. They were not demons or undead like in Beowulf, but still, for some strange reason, they were still evil. Sure, you could explain they worship evil gods like Grumsh or even demons like Orcus, and you can see the element of childhood indoctrination. Most people follow the religion or ideology of their parents, but even in the most Catholic or Sunni countries, there's always people who break away from it, who discard that indoctrination and become atheists or turn to a completely different religion. You should be seeing a lot more orcs who just go, is Gromsh really good for us? Because of this connection to demons and the underworld, the orcs frequently either come from the Underdark or similar underworlds, or have once lived there before leaving for the surface world. It's a motif that appears surprisingly often for a creature that isn't inherently tied to it. These orcs appear in most common fantasy settings, too many to really mention here, even in D&D, writers started to realize that always chaotic evil races carry some unfortunate implications. You can find them in Forgotten Realms, or Greyhawk, or the original Orcs of Warcraft 1, who were rather uncomplicated, and also said to have come from the underworld. Mind you, that was also when God was still mentioned in Alliance lore, so that was a very long time ago. Orcs of many younger worlds like Golarion still have shades of it that begin to evolve into the other major type of orcs. Once the controversies about the portrayal of orcs began to mount and the writers started to realize the issue, we started seeing an evolution of orcs into a more honorable warrior type. We often credit Blizzard with inventing this type of orc, but they weren't really the first ones, and not even the first ones to make them green. Probably the oldest example of honorable green orcs actually comes from the Elder Scrolls. Though they weren't a playable race in Arena or Daggerfall, in the latter they appear as a major faction that you can give the Totem of Tiber Septim to. In the original game, that was your choice of ending. You could have given the orcs the key to become a major power in High Rock and Hammerfell. Orsinium still became a major regional player, and orcs became a playable race. The Tamriel orcs are green, and though they are seen as these brutish savages by their neighbors, they are in fact honorable warriors. This was before Warcraft 3. They are technically corrupted elves, which does harken back to Tolkien a little bit, but it's not really emphasized. I don't think Blizzard was really inspired by these, but they accidentally arrived at the same result. Some old Blizzard writers became huge fans of the Horde and Orcs and wanted to give them a sense of redemption. Though the backstory of Grom and others drinking the demon blood was already there by Warcraft 3, the third game really focused on the old shamanistic culture they were supposed to have before that. One of the main heroes of the game, Thrall, having been spared being raised by the corrupted Orcs, sought to return to their old culture. And I have to say, Blizzard has not been very consistent on them being more peaceful before. They say that the bloodlust comes from the demon blood, but then Manoroth dies and supposedly frees them from it, but they can still do it. And then we go to the alternate past Draenor, and the definitely uncorrupted orcs who never drank the blood still have it. So that messaging ends up being not very clear. These green orcs are now far more popular in modern fantasy settings, even if they aren't necessarily green. Modern D&D tries to avoid references to skin color, and modern video games often portray at least half orcs as green. Matt Mercer's Exandria, coloring orcs anywhere between green and grey, deliberately tries to avoid it, and addresses the topic by making it a myth, misinformation. The orcs of Golarion, of Pathfinder, though their backstory starts similar to grey orcs, end up on the green side of the spectrum in the end, valuing honesty and pragmatism. Even in the 90s, the Scraw of Spelljammer tried to be different and more militaristic and regimented. However, not all attempts to redeem orcs end up in this category. One honorable mention here before I move on to the next category is Klingons of Star Trek. Not technically orcs, because sci-fi and not green, but they seem to have had a huge influence on the culture that developed around these green orcs. There is a strange switcheroo regarding Klingons and Romulans, where in the original series Klingons were the treacherous ones and Romulans were the honorable opponents. And then in the next generation it's Klingons, who always talk a lot about honor, and Romulans who keep sending spies. But it's those latter Klingons that modern writers often fall back on when they imagine what orcs should behave like. A type of orcs I dubbed brown orcs, even if they don't have to be brown because it's not about skin color. This term might make Americans cringe a little bit because of their association with putting brown in front of people, but it has nothing to do with brown people or skin. Not all non-grey orcs end up being those honorable orcs. There is really so many different ways they could proceed when untied from those demonic origins, but there are some common themes between those other examples. Eberron orcs are my primary example of brown orcs, though colored the same grey to green as all the rest, like you will see for most of these cases. They are largely spiritual and peaceful and closer to the earth, and that's really where I get the brown more so than their actual skin color. It symbolizes their connection to the earth. They have more stable, structured settlements, and are less often nomadic and see themselves as having a duty to protect the world. Eberron orcs are such a stark diversion from most settings, like a lot of things on Eberron, and that they really stand out as an example. While Warcraft has orcs that are literally brown, they are culturally closer to those green orcs. They are supposed to be this shamanistic origin of the culture Thrall later espoused, and though the Maghar orcs were described as peaceful, we have since seen that warlike reputation didn't come entirely out of the demon blood. It didn't take Garrosh a lot to convince the orcs to invade an alternate timeline. Look, Warlords of Draenor was a mess, but it gave us a better insight into the orcs, and they were not these orcs, despite the color. It's important to note that in the revised D&D 5.5 edition, the 2024 rules, D&D tried to move orcs away from the old stereotypes and ended up creating something akin to the brown orcs. The player's handbook seems to whitewash not just the orcs as a species, but Grumsh himself, talking about them wondering when Grumsh will call on them to match the heroic deeds of old. I mean, I don't mind, obviously I don't mind the idea of this type of orcs, but that's not the orcs or Grumsh of any established setting. So like, what's the lore? Where are these from? It ends up just dropping just a completely new orcs from some unknown world that don't match any other world's lore. And then it just moves on without commenting on it. I don't mind having these types of orcs, but where did they come from? Something I have to bring up regarding brown orcs is, of course, Dragon Age. It was one of the key design goals of the setting to subvert the idea of orcs as these monsters to be killed by the dozens. So what they ended up with was the Qunari. Qunari are by far one of my favorite parts of Dragon Age because, on the surface, they feel like such a unique, distinct race. Still, you can see how they are conceptually descended from orcs. They are bigger and stronger than humans. People call them the Grey Ones. They are very pragmatic, and much of the Qunari we see are warriors. But as a subversion, that's because the warriors are one of the few who get out. Back home, they have a very complex society with a very alien and very regimented societal order. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, because you could go on for hours about them, but given their origin and their culture, they fall very much into my brown orc category. And then they added the Darkspawn, which are just about the greyest type of orc. They're not called orcs, but they are mooks you can slaughter by the dozens, but usually talkative, come from corrupted members of other races. With such a beautiful subversion as the Qunari, it really is a little bit surprising to have those here too. Even if I like how messed up the Darkspawn can be. I struggle to find more big examples of these in fiction, and I wish more writers did it, to give orcs a wider spectrum than just good warriors and bad warriors, and at least in my world of Shoestone, I will try to find a place for them, given the origin of orcs as the Titans' replacement for humans, when these humans ended up fighting for the new gods. And with the Titans defeated, these orcs now needed to find a new place in the world. Then we have the Orcs, written with a K. Though you can see orcs written that way no matter what their culture ends up being, the orcs I mean are primarily the Warhammer 40k orcs. They feel like for the most part they fit into the grey orc archetype, but they're just so weird, I just have to talk about them a little bit. I'm not really a Warhammer person, fantasy or 40k, but they really stand out for me. 40k orcs like to fight. In fact, it's their whole reason for being. All they do is fight things, but that's just the surface. First off, they're fungi. They reproduce by seeding spores that just happen to end up growing into something that looks like an orc. The most important thing about them is their beliefs kind of make things true. They paint all their ships red, and because they believe painting something red makes it go faster, it does. I've seen orc spaceships with open windows in space because the orcs don't believe the air would escape. They have been described as British football hooligans, and that certainly makes for a very unique culture that distinguishes itself from all the others. I don't think that British football hooligans have the power to make things true by believing in them. At least I hope they don't have that power, because that would have some really unfortunate implications. Something that ought to be mentioned with these categories of orcs is that unlike any of the other categorizations we've made in the previous videos, you will very rarely see these types coexisting. How you treat your orcs almost becomes an artistic statement. You will either see the stereotypical evil orcs, or you will see the honorable warrior orcs, or sometimes you will see the shamanistic orcs. I can't off the top of my head give you a world that has multiple, besides worlds that evolved with time and slowly replaced one type with another. All these types really stem from the controversies around orcs. Without comparing orcs to any specific cultures or ethnicities from the real world, there is always the underlying issue that I kept talking about throughout. The issue of an always chaotic evil race. We've grown up as a culture a lot since the 70s, and even Tolkien regretted portraying his orcs as such. It comes as no surprise that we try to move on from this portrayal. However, I don't think we need to entirely abandon it. I am, of course, vehemently opposed to evil races. No intelligent, free-willed, true-breeding race will be always evil. Unless you are some kind of demon or otherwise supernaturally tied to some cosmic force, you can always choose to be different from other people around you. I strongly believe that any intelligent being is born neutral, not good, not evil, but they are then shaped by their environment. And that's where I depart a little bit from modern fantasy tendencies. I don't believe in evil races, but I believe in evil cultures. While the term evil is debatable, there can be cultures that emphasize different values. Some of those values will be quote-unquote evil. A culture that focuses on your survival above everything else is a culture that will teach you to be cruel and callous. You can of course diverge from the culture that raised you, but if some culture somewhere was taught and raised to worship demons, chances are pretty good that people raised among them will not question those values. If someone was raised in a totalitarian country, they will often see the Western ideas of liberty as something corrupt and anarchist. Therefore, I believe there is a place for grey orcs and green orcs and brown orcs and maybe more types to coexist in the same world. The grey orcs were taught to depend on themselves and sacrifice other people for their own good. The green orcs were taught to value honesty, pragmatism, and honor. The brown orcs were raised in sacred nature places, and that indoctrinated them in a way to value nature above all else. None of these are really evil, but they may see each other as evil, because their values differ, because that's what we do as people. I think this is the key to having these different types of orcs coexist, seeing the real human motivations for every type. Well, that was a heavy one. I'm sure this won't cause any controversies. I feel like this is one of the videos that will either not get seen by anyone or will get a lot of dislikes because people will be offended by the idea of the old-fashioned orcs still being used anywhere, probably without watching the whole video. We'll see how that really works out. Whenever a video pops off, I often start to get comments when I'm like, did you even watch the video? Or did you just see the title, click, and then leave immediately? Because people correct me, tell me I'm wrong, and then say the correct answer is exactly the same thing I said. okay? And I'm not here to complain about the comments. I hope you liked the video, and if you didn't, if you have any other types of orcs in fiction you'd like to bring up, or if you think I categorized any particular examples wrong, do let me know in the comments below. This was as usual the video people voted for, though this one had a much more even vote than some of the previous ones. I do wonder what you will want to see next. But meanwhile, this will be it for today, and I hope to see you next time.